Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. It's my pleasure to introduce this morning our speaker, Dr. Angela Wiesenmeyer. Dr. Wiesenmeyer is a clinical associate professor of child health at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, and also she serves at Valleywise Health Center and District Medical Group. She's originally from Tucson and attended the University of Arizona College of Medicine in Tucson, where she obtained a dual MD, MPH degree. Then she completed her pediatric residency at the University of Arizona, and then went on to practice as a pediatric hospitalist for several years in the Midwest. She then went on to complete a fellowship in pediatric infectious disease at the University of Utah, and she then moved to help start a pediatric residency program as an associate program director at Valley Children's Hospital in Central California. Then in 2020, she returned to her home state here in Arizona to work at Valleywise Health Medical Center, where she still practices part-time as a pediatric infectious disease specialist. So without anything further, I will introduce Dr. Wiesenmeyer, and she is going to talk to us today about raw milk, the utter truth.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. You can hear me okay? I successfully unmuted myself, I hope.
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, excellent. All right, we'll go ahead and get started then. All right, the utter truth about the raw milk movement. I have no financial disclosures, conflicts of interest, and I will not be promoting any products during this talk. Here's your objectives. We are going to go over some pathogens and clinical infections that are associated with raw or unpasteurized milk. I'll use those terms interchangeably. We'll talk about the Arizona laws as well as federal laws regarding the sale and distribution of raw milk, and then we'll talk about how you can talk to your patients about raw milk. Okay, to understand where we are, we have to know where we have been. So we are going to go through a not so brief history lesson, but I will try to make it quick. Although when I was researching this talk, I actually become very fascinated with the history of pasteurization and milk. So maybe I'll spark your interest too. All right, so we're going to go way back to the 1800s, 1840 to 1860. So around this time is when small cow herds and farms, particularly dairy farms, started declining with the Industrial Revolution. Everybody was moving to the urban centers, the big cities. And so there was an issue with, all right, well, how are the cities going to have milk? So dairy farms, dairy processing plants actually moved into the cities during that time. And cow herds went from maybe 50 to 70 cows at a small farm to as many as 2,000 cows in these huge urban farms where they processed the milk and distributed it to people living in the cities. So these larger dairy herds were exclusively fed what's called slop house at swill dairies. And basically what that means is that enterprising individuals would build these dairies next to distilleries. And the waste from the distilleries, which was called just mash, distillery mash, was actually fed to the cows. And so what happened is they produced really poor quality milk at that time. So the milk was very thin and actually had this blue color. So in order to make the milk more appetizing, because no one wanted to drink thin blue milk, they actually added things like plaster of Paris, charcoal, starch, sugar, flour, egg. It was actually pretty disgusting. So bad, in fact, that some doctors advised parents not to give their children any milk at all. So around this time, infant mortality also escalated. So diarrheal disease was actually one of the leading causes of death in children around this time. And one of the main culprits was milk. Because there was such an issue getting fresh milk from the farms into the urban centers because they didn't have a way to cool it, so it would spoil and grow pathogens. And because of these swill dairies that were in the cities, children were dying from milk-borne transmitted infectious diseases. particularly in the summer from diarrhea, and so they coined it summer diarrhea. So you guys should recognize these two gentlemen, Dr. Koch, Dr. Pasteur. These scientists between the years of 1860-ish to 1870 were working in their labs, and they were demonstrating the role of microbes in fermentation of beer and wine in particular. So Pasteur actually didn't work on milk at all. He worked on beer and wine. And then Koch, as you know from Koch's postulates, was demonstrating that the causative role of microorganisms in infections rather than bad humors or miasmas were actually causing infectious disease. So interesting, Pasteur worked on beer and wine industries, and the very first pasteurization in the United States was actually done by Anheuser-Busch Brewery. This is Abraham Jacobi. He was a German pediatrician who was working in New York City around the late 1800s. He's actually considered to be the father of American pediatrics. And he was actually a vocal proponent of pasteurization because they were, for milk in particular, because they were using pasteurization in other countries like Denmark, Sweden, Germany. So he would go around and talk about the benefits of pasteurization and actually created a home apparatus for heating milk for infants at home. This is Nathan Strauss. He was also an advocate for pasteurization in the late 1800s. He owned Macy's in New York City. And he and his wife actually lost two of their children to tuberculosis that was transmitted through milk. That was one of the infections that at the time was transmitted through milk. So he traveled around and talked about the need for pasteurization to protect infants and children against infectious disease. And he created a program where they pasteurized milk for disadvantaged children living in the tenements of New York City. This Henry Coit, this is not actually a picture of him, but this is what I imagine he would look like. He was another influential pediatrician. So are you recognizing a pattern here? Pediatricians are on the forefront of this pasteurization push. And his son died of milk-borne illness. So he actually was responsible for establishing the very first certified milk dairy in the US. So the certification relied on standards of cleanliness. So nothing to do with the milk. This was not pasteurization yet. But what they did is they recruited other physicians to actually walk through the dairies and certify them for cleanliness in terms of how they kept their cows and the surrounding environment. So they would certify that the milk was processed under strict hygiene standards. But again, this was not enough because they weren't doing anything with the actual milk. And so milk-borne TB was still transmitted and was actually transmitted through Dr. Coit's dairy, unfortunately. So now we're up to the early 1900s. Around this time, the most common milk-borne illness was Salmonella typhi and paratyphi. So in 1905-ish, there was a huge outbreak in Washington, D.C. of typhoid fever, and it was transmitted by milk. So President Teddy Roosevelt, that's who you're seeing there, he ordered a study of milk hygiene to be done in 1905. In 1909, the study was complete. There was a man by the name of Dr. Milton Rosenau, and he published what's known as the Rosenau Report. And this recommended, based on all of the evidence that they had gathered, that all milk be pasteurized. So that was really the first official government recommendation for pasteurization for all milk. And his quote, I think this is important, he said, "Next to water purification, pasteurization is the most important single preventive measure in the field of sanitation." So once that happened, things progressed pretty rapidly. So now we're up to around 1915. By this time, in major US cities, most of the milk was pasteurized now. We're not doing the swill dairies anymore. We're beyond that. Now we're pasteurizing the milk in the major US cities. About 1936 or so, up till 1940, about 98, 99% of the milk produced in major US cities was pasteurized. But it wasn't until the 1950s that the milk produced in the more rural areas was pasteurized. So there was a long period of time, a couple decades at least, that we're ramping up on pasteurization. This brings us all the way up to 1987. This is a picture of what a pasteurization facility might have looked like then. It was in 1987 that the FDA mandated that all milk and milk products, so that includes cheese and heavy cream, in final package form for human consumption, be pasteurized before shipping in interstate commerce. So there's federal legislation, and this still holds today, that you cannot uh, sell raw milk or unpasteurized dairy products across state lines. Now, each state has their own laws regarding the sale of raw or unpasteurized dairy products, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. As recently as 2012, the federal government denied a petition requesting federal level legalization of the interstate selling of raw and unpasteurized products. So they denied that in 2012 based on the scientific evidence of the benefits of pasteurization. So that brings us up to present day, 2026. This is a picture of Shamrock Farms, right outside of Phoenix. This was taken there. These are the happy cows. They're actually very eager to get milked. And yeah, that's what it looks like now. We've come a long way. So what is pasteurization? So pasteurization is actually fairly simple. When the cows are milked, the milk gets chilled right away down to 39 degrees. And it's held there until it goes through the pasteurization process, which consists of sending milk through heated stainless steel metal plates, heating it up to 161 degrees. It's held there for 15 seconds, at least 15 seconds, and then it's rapidly cooled again back to its original temperature of 39 degrees. So that's it. That's what pasteurization is. There's also ultra pasteurization. You might see that label in the grocery store and some milk products. That basically they heat it to a higher heat for a shorter period of time, and then it prolongs the shelf life. So let's talk about, we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about the scope of raw milk consumption. So why are we even talking about this? Who drinks raw milk? How often are people drinking raw milk? We're going to talk about that. So based on information from the 2016 Food Safety Survey and the 2019 Food Safety Nutrition Survey conducted by the FDA, they looked at the prevalence, frequency, and demographic predictors of consumption of raw milk in US adults. And what they found was that about 4.4% of US adults reported that they drink raw milk at least once in the past year. Now, this is just raw milk. This isn't eating unpasteurized cheese. 1.6% reported that they had it at least once a month, maybe more. And then 1% drank raw milk once a week or more. The raw milk drinkers were more likely to be younger, live in rural areas, and live in states where the retail sale of raw milk is allowed. So who are those states? Here's a map. Arizona, you can see down here, the dark blue. General retail sale of raw milk is allowed here in Arizona. You can see some of the other states, Colorado, all sale is prohibited, but herd share is expressly allowed. So Arizona does not allow herd shares. What herd shares are, basically it is a farm and anybody can buy an interest in a cow on that farm. So they purchase the interest in it. So anything that cow produces is considered theirs. So they don't actually have to then buy the milk from the cow. And that is how they get around some of the legal challenges of selling raw milk across state lines, because it's not technically selling if a person in another state owns part of that cow. So that's what a herd share is. Arizona does not allow herd shares. You can see some states do. Down here, the orange states, all sale is prohibited, and they don't have a provision for herd shares, but Louisiana down here prohibits herd shares and the sale of raw milk. There are 4 dairies in Arizona that are certified to sell raw milk. You can see them there: Fond du Lac, Golden Rule, Sunset Farms, and Desert Oasis. Now, there's just 4 currently. Any dairy can apply for certification to be able to sell raw milk. So there's just 4 currently. So all of the dairies in the state have to be certified and monitored through the Arizona Department of Agriculture, and that includes those 4 dairies that produce raw milk for sale. So the Arizona Department of Agriculture holds all dairies to the same standard, including the dairies that produce raw milk, which are typically, obviously, small family-run farms. So I wanted to touch a little bit on the monitoring process, because I think that most people don't know this, and I think it's important to be educated consumers. So roughly monthly, the Arizona Department of Agriculture gets samples of milk from the dairies around the state, including the dairies that produce raw milk. And they do 3 main tests of the milk. They plate it on agar and look at the total aerobic plate count, which is basically the amount of colonies of aerobic bacteria that grow from that milk sample. They look at the coliform count, so specifically bacteria that are considered coliforms. They do those on separate plates. They look at how much coliform grows. And then they look for the presence of beta-lactam antibiotics in particular, because they want to know if the cows are being given antibiotics inappropriately. So it's really important to note that that is the extent of the monitoring. They don't look for specific pathogens. They don't look for salmonella. They don't look for brucella. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. They don't look for Campylobacter. So beyond the amount of bacteria that's growing on the plate, that's what they do. There's no federal mandate for screening for pathogens in milk, so the state doesn't do it either. So once there is a violation, so let's say the amount of bacteria that's seen on the total aerobic plate count is higher than the threshold deemed acceptable, the dairy is notified. However, that milk sample has already been shipped out to the stores. So because milk spoils so quickly, they can't wait for all the testing to be done in order to give the okay to send out the milk. So the public would never know if their particular milk from that dairy failed and has a warning now and will have to resubmit samples. So I think just it's important to be aware of that there is monitoring, but it's not like real time. This milk is contaminated. Let's not let it get on the shelves, because that horse is already out of the barn, or that cow is out of the barn, I guess. So this is a picture from my local Sprouts. This is the one closest to my house. And I want you just to take just a brief look at that and see if you can pick out the raw milk fairly easily. Give you a second to look. Here's a close-up shot. There's the raw milk, clearly labeled, sort of. There's Golden Rule Dairy and Fond du Lac Farms sell in my local Sprouts. You can see, like, it's not super obvious at first glance, which is the pasteurized milk and which is the raw milk. And then in the fine print, which you can't read on the slide, all raw milk is required to be labeled as unpasteurized, and that it may contain pathogens that can be detrimental to your health. It's on there somewhere, I think, in the fine print. Okay, so now we are going to shift gears and talk a little bit about micro and clinical stuff. But don't worry, we're going to get back to the public health stuff in a minute. So milk contains beneficial flora. This is pasteurized and raw milk. It contains stuff that we consider to be good bacteria. So Lactococcus, Lactobacillus, and Leuconostoc are the main ones. It also contains, naturally, spoilage flora. So these are the organisms that can grow at low temperatures. So this is what turns your milk bad when it gets close to that expiration date. Um, these guys are at fault. Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, Serratia, and Aeromonas. These are the pathogens. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are the most common pathogens, and these are the ones that I'm going to talk about this morning in a little more detail. This is why you should even care about raw milk. Like, this is the whole point of the talk, is because these are the pathogens that can be transmitted through unpasteurized dairy products. And I'm going to go through them one by one. Some of this you guys are going to be familiar with. Campylobacter can present in kids as fever, abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea. These kids can have bloody stools. Can also cause pretty severe right lower quadrant abdominal pain. And so this is a condition known as pseudoappendicitis. So if you have something like that, think Campylobacter. And then it can also cause seizures, although the seizures typically, I think, are more related to the fever and happen before the diarrhea starts. Some important complications of Campylobacter that we need to be aware of: reactive arthritis. So this can occur about a week or two after the diarrheal illness, and for that we can just give NSAIDs. Guillain-Barré syndrome. Campylobacter is the most common precipitant of Guillain-Barré syndrome, and this also can occur about a week or two after the diarrhea. And then post-infectious irritable bowel syndrome, so chronic abdominal pain, change in bowel habits that can actually last for quite a while after Campylobacter. All right, Listeria monocytogenes, L mono, as we affectionately refer to it in the ID world. So can also cause fever. This is more watery diarrhea, not so much bloody diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, headache, joint pain, pretty nonspecific. However, we know Listeria can cause some pretty nasty things as well. So bacteremia, this actually occurs more commonly in elderly patients, not so much in kids. Can cause meningoencephalitis, which is actually more common than just isolated meningitis. Pregnant women, as we know, pose a particular risk for listeriosis. Listeriosis in pregnant women is 10 times more likely than the general population, and it can cause fetal loss, preterm labor, and then neonatal sepsis. We know that Listeria is one of the organisms that we worry about, especially in that first 7 to 10 days of life. Can cause meningitis and sepsis. It's transmitted either during or right after delivery. Shiga toxin producing E. coli, also known as STEC. This one also presents as diarrhea, not so much fevers though, and this can definitely have bloody stools. Patients with this typically have normal labs initially. However, we know that specifically the serotype 0157H7 can cause hemolytic uremic syndrome in a minority of kids who are infected with STEC. The triad for that is anemia, thrombocytopenia, and acute kidney injury. Now, that typically doesn't happen until about day of illness 7, day of illness 1 being the first day of diarrhea. So just to be aware of that, even if they have normal labs at the beginning, if it's about a week into the illness, we want to check labs if we know that they have STEC. And it's much more common in kids less than 10 years of age. Salmonella causes diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, fever. So to differentiate this from S-tech, Salmonella does more commonly cause fever. Excuse me. Can cause fatigue, malaise, chills, headache. It's typically not bloody. Can cause bacteremia, osteo, meningitis, and visceral abscesses. Now, this is typically in kids less than a year of age or the immune compromised. So older kids with salmonella, we typically don't see these complications. And then brucella. So this one causes, I think, the most weird presentations that I have seen of all of these pathogens. So brucellosis, they can present with fever, malaise, night sweats, arthralgia, pretty nonspecific. But what's unusual is that a lot of these patients have low back pain, even if they don't have a focal infection in the spine or the SI joints. They have low back pain. They can have pretty significant anorexia and also depression. I remember a patient, an adolescent girl I saw with brucellosis, and one of her striking symptoms was a very flat affect. Quite interesting. The most common complication of brucella is actually osteoarticular disease, particularly sacroiliitis or spondylitis of the lumbar vertebrae. So even without that focal infection, these patients can have back pain, but when they do have a focal brucella infection, it's typically in one of those areas. Can also cause meningitis, GU involvement, which is fairly unique among these pathogens, and then fetal death as well. All right. Okay, we're going to talk about how big is this issue that we're talking about with raw milk and unpasteurized dairy. So this was a study called the Global Burden of Foodborne Diseases Initiative by the WHO. And they stated that about 4% of all foodborne zoonotic diseases across the globe are due to milk. 12% of the disease burden from animal source food from dairy. And then dairy causes about 10% of the foodborne deaths in the United States. So most of the worldwide burden of diseases passed through dairy and milk affect low resourced countries. And here in the US, in the lower resourced areas as well. So this was a study by Costard et al. That used modeling of publicly available outbreak data to estimate outbreak-related illnesses and hospitalizations caused by these particular bacteria, S-tech, Salmonella, Listeria, and Campylobacter, in the US between 2009 and 2014. Now, they specifically wanted to look at outbreaks that were transmitted through cow's milk and cheese. They found that there was a total of 760 illnesses per year and 22 hospitalizations per year. 96% of those illnesses were caused by unpasteurized dairy, which means that those who were exposed to unpasteurized dairy were 840 times more likely to have illness and 45 times more likely to be hospitalized. This is a different study. This is my favorite one that I read. This is foodborne illness outbreaks linked to unpasteurized milk and its relationship to state laws. So we talked a little bit about the state laws earlier. We know that Arizona allows the sale of unpasteurized dairy products in retail stores. So this study found between the years of 2013 and 2018, there were 75 outbreaks total. 675 illnesses. Almost half of those were in kids. So you can see the breakdown there. 15% of the illnesses resulted in hospitalizations. There were 10 cases of HUS, 2 cases of Guillain-Barré, and then 2 deaths, one caused by Campylobacter and one caused by Listeria. Same study, there were 74 single state outbreaks. 78% of those outbreaks occurred in states where the sale of unpasteurized dairy products is legal. So, in jurisdictions where unpasteurized milk sales were allowed, they were estimated to have 3.2 times more outbreaks and 2.9 times more outbreak-associated illnesses. Same study, they showed that in jurisdictions that allowed retail sale, so this slide was just allowed sale, so that could just be on the farm. This is in jurisdictions that allow retail sale. So like in my local Sprouts, they are 3.6 times more likely to have outbreaks and 3.2 times more outbreak-associated illnesses. Overall, Utah, where I did my ID fellowship, had the highest number of outbreaks in this study. So this was published in MMWR, the Morbidity Mortality World Report last year about this time. This is one of the largest foodborne outbreaks linked to raw milk in recent history. So this took place between September 2023 and March 2024. This was in California mainly, but also reached 4 other states. This was an outbreak of Salmonella typhimurium. There was 171 cases total in that time span. The median age was only 7 years, and 39% of the kids who got sick were less than 5 years of age. And there were no deaths, thankfully, during this outbreak. One of the most important findings of this outbreak was that cheese produced from raw milk was found to have salmonella even after having been aged for 60 days. So I'm not sure I mentioned this before, but even though interstate sale of raw milk is illegal, according to federal law, you can sell unpasteurized cheese across state lines as long as it has been aged for at least 60 days. The thought was that if it's been aged for that long, there's no viable bacteria, so there's really no risk in selling it across state lines. However, during this outbreak, they discovered that some of the cheese from this farm that was sold across state lines, that was not pasteurized, did grow salmonella despite having been aged for 60 days. So that was quite worrisome. These are some of the recent outbreaks just in the last year, just in 2026. You can see there, these are some of the headlines that I came across about raw milk outbreaks this year. So the AAP has published a policy statement regarding consumption of raw or unpasteurized milk and milk products by pregnant women and children. This was initially published in 2014, and it was reaffirmed in 2025, so just last year. These are the 3 main recommendations from that policy statement. They state that pregnant women, infants, and children should really only have pasteurized milk and milk products. They actually advocate for a ban on the sale of unpasteurized milk and milk products throughout the US. And they encourage pediatricians to contact their state representatives to support a ban on the sale of raw milk and raw milk products. And maybe some of you will be inspired to do that after this talk. Okay, we're going to shift gears again to talking to our patients about raw milk. There's a lot of information out there about raw milk, a lot of websites that your patients might be reading, people that they might be talking to. other people in the healthcare field that might be sharing their opinions on raw milk. And I wanted to give you some talking points to use when your patients come to you with some of these questions or claims. So the first one, and this is one that I have heard from people as well, that raw milk retains beneficial enzymes and vitamins that pasteurized milk just does not have, loses in the pasteurization process. And here's our response. Pasteurization does slightly reduce some nutrients, but calcium and protein, so the major things that we get from milk, are unaffected by the pasteurization process. So some of the vitamin levels might be modestly diminished, but these are things that are found in milk in low levels anyway, so milk is not a major source of these vitamins and minerals, and mainly you can get them through other foods. So that is something that you can explain to your patients when they bring up that specific claim. Another one, raw milk has natural probiotics that are good for gut health. Yes, pasteurization does kill natural bacteria, but it also kills harmful pathogens. And there are other ways that probiotics can be added to one's diet that doesn't increase the risk of infectious disease. Can be added safely through fermented dairy. So, we often tell our patients on antibiotics to eat some yogurt, drink some kefir. There are other ways to get those probiotics. You can even just get them over the counter. Another claim, raw milk is better tolerated by lactose intolerant people. Well, this just isn't true. Lactose intolerant people react to both raw and pasteurized milk because the pasteurization process does not remove lactose. So lactose-free pasteurized milk is the safest option for those people. Raw milk may reduce the risk of asthma and allergies in children. So you might have heard this one. I feel like this one is out there circulating. This one's a little more complex. It's actually based on a study that was published in 2007 that's frequently misinterpreted. So consuming raw milk obviously does not in itself cure or treat asthma or allergies. But what this study found, this study that was published in 2007 called the Parsifal study, they found an inverse association of farm milk consumption, not raw milk consumption, but farm milk consumption, which is milk that was produced and consumed in the same farm. So they found an inverse association with farm milk consumption and asthma and allergy incidence. However, it's important to note that that farm milk consumed during the study, about half of it was actually boiled. So in a sense, almost pasteurized before they drank it. So it wasn't that they were drinking raw milk. However, they still found that there was this inverse relationship with allergies and asthma. So potentially, as we know, there are other environmental factors that contribute to reducing the risk of asthma and allergy in children, and it doesn't have to do specifically with drinking raw milk. So that study, the authors made it clear, they actually stated in the conclusion that, quote, raw milk may contain pathogens such as salmonella or enterohemorrhagic E. coli, and its consumption may therefore imply serious health risk. Consumption of raw farm milk cannot be recommended as a preventive measure. So that is what you can bring up when your patients bring up that raw milk may reduce their incidence of asthma and allergies. Probably not true. Raw milk is more natural and less processed. Kind of true. However, pasteurization is a basic safety measure. It's not heavy processing. We talked about the process of pasteurization. It just involves heating the milk. It doesn't involve any sort of chemical processing at all. So Yes, raw milk is more natural and less processed in that it's not heated, it's not pasteurized, but also, as we saw, much more dangerous. And the last claim, industrial dairy practices are unsafe and or unhealthy. Well, we know that food safety systems ensure that milk is tested, monitored, and pasteurized to prevent outbreaks. In Arizona, at least, the Department of Agriculture holds raw milk dairies to the same standard as pasteurized milk dairies. So Shamrock Farms is held to the same standard as Fond du Lac Farms. Raw milk processing can vary widely in quality. So remember, these aren't scientists and microbiologists that work at these farms. They're farmers. And so they might not have the strict hygiene and understanding of the transmission of infectious disease that maybe scientists have in the larger dairy farms and the larger plants where pasteurization occurs. So bottom line, the industrial dairy practices are, as we talked about, they have strict hygiene standards. And so really, there's nothing unhealthy or unsafe about the processing and pasteurization of milk in the larger dairies. Okay, so that was it. That was our speed lesson through the history of pasteurization and some of the dangers of raw milk. And I am open to questions. I have not been looking at the chat, but I do have time for questions if there are any. There are any questions for me.
Okay, we have one already in the Q&A. Uh, the question is, some people will argue that getting raw milk direct from the dairies, similar to a century ago, is different than buying it at a store, as people used to drink milk from their own communities before industrialization. How do you discuss this with people that live on or near a dairy farm?
Yeah. So I think it's important to stress that yes, it's wonderful to support small businesses, it's wonderful to support dairy farms. Um, it's also wonderful to protect yourselves and your children from infectious diseases as much as we can. Um, Obviously, you can't protect them from everything, but I hope that I've demonstrated in this talk that it's not an insignificant risk and it's not an insignificant danger of acquiring infectious diseases, infectious pathogens from raw and unpasteurized milk. Um, I think cheese, obviously, maybe a little bit safer because it's aged, or if it's aged for greater than 60 days. But even that, I demonstrated in the outbreak that occurred a year ago. They still found Salmonella typhimurium in that cheese, even though it had been aged. So, um, yeah, I would just stress that pasteurization itself, it's not a lot of processing. It's really just heating. It's killing the pathogens. Pathogens come back eventually. That's why there's an expiration date on milk. But in the meantime, we can make our milk safer to drink. And, um, some say it changes the taste a little bit. And that might be true. I don't know. I've never drank raw milk. I don't know what it tastes like. Don't think I'll ever find out. But I feel like that's a small sacrifice for safety from things like Campylobacter.
Okay, another question came in. Please talk about TB in milk.
Oh, you want a whole nother hour? Um, so Mycobacterium bovis and Mycobacterium tuberculosis, both of those pathogens can be transmitted through milk. I have not heard of any outbreaks of those in recent history. I think that was more, back in the mid 1800s, but at the time, it was thought that cows couldn't transmit those specific organisms to humans. And then they were wrong. So kids actually got both Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but also Mycobacterium bovis, M. bovis, which can cause a similar type disease to the traditional tuberculosis that we know about. So there, that exhausts my knowledge of TB transmitted through milk.
Okay. I still got some questions coming in.
Okay.
Okay, one of them from our ID doc here. A great and very timely talk. Thank you. Are you aware of any initiatives on the legislative level from the AZAAP chapter to advocate for banning raw milk in Arizona?
Oh, that is a great question, and I don't know. Um, I feel like I should know that. I should have looked into that, but honestly, I don't know. If anybody else knows, anyone who's active in AZAAP wants to chime in, that would be great. But I don't know.
Okay. Couple more. Next one is, are the dairy testing results publicly available? Also, is there any literature about which cows are getting more antibiotics, raw milk versus pasteurized?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you for asking. No. So the dairy violations are not made public. So because the Department of Ag does not screen for specific pathogens, they can't say like, this dairy had O157H7 or this dairy had salmonella. They don't know that information. They just know that there's more bacteria than should have been there. So they submit a report, the dairy is notified, and then the dairy has a chance to resubmit samples of milk for testing. They actually have to go, they are allowed a few sort of warnings or violations before it's sort of taken to the next level. Um, Dairies can be shut down if they have too many violations. They can be shut down by, or not shut down by the Arizona Department of Ag, but the Department of Ag just reports the results and then the state will shut the dairy down. That actually doesn't happen very often. Um, but no, so those results are not publicly available. Now, if there is an outbreak of an infectious disease that can be traced back to the dairy, that would be publicly available information. And
Okay.
then, sorry, what was the second part of the
The second
question?
part is, is there any literature about which cows are getting more
Oh,
antibiotics? Meaning, if you buy raw milk, are you getting less cows that were given less antibiotics than if you were getting normal pasteurized milk?
right. That is a great question. I didn't dive down that rabbit hole too much, although I really wanted to. So there is some literature. There is literature that suggests that um, maybe dairies who produce raw milk do rely on antibiotic treatment quite a bit. Some of that is in between sort of the milking seasons for the cows. They load them up with antibiotics to prevent things like mastoiditis, and to try to decrease, excuse me, decrease the amount of pathogens in the milk. So one of the reasons that the Arizona Department of Ag screens for beta-lactam antibiotics is specifically for that reason. However, they only screen for beta-lactams. They don't screen for other types of antibiotics. So cows could certainly, dairies can get around that by giving non-beta-lactam antibiotics to their cows. And there's really no way we would know. So I can't say for sure, like the dairies that pasteurize give more antibiotics, but I can say that one of the ways that farms that produce raw milk might try to get around some violations is to give antibiotics that are non-beta-lactam antibiotics.
Okay. Next question. Are the raw dairy farms in Arizona only producing raw milk?
I believe so. I don't know for sure, but I believe so
Okay.
because they're small family-run farms, and so they might not have the resources to devote to pasteurization.
Okay. Someone else asked about, do you have any data comparing raw cow milk versus raw goat milk?
I don't have any data. I didn't run across any articles that separated the two out. Um, so I don't, yeah, I'm just gonna say I don't know that data. That's an interesting question. I don't have the answer to that.
Okay. And then the next one, thank you, Dr. Wiesemeyer. Does the antibiotic administration increase antibiotic resistance in children?
Yes. I know there are studies that
Yeah.
show that. Again, I thought the talk was going to be a bit too long to include all the antibiotic stuff, which is it's one of my favorite things in the whole world. But um, I did see that, and yes, absolutely, it does. We know that antibiotic resistance, we kind of see the canary in the coal mines in other countries first, in less resource countries. Who use antibiotics to cut down on infectious disease because they don't have the sanitation measures and resources that we do. But certainly here we see antibiotic resistant bacteria in the cows themselves and in the milk. When we look for that in the milk in particular, there's a few articles about that. And certainly then those are also being transmitted to our patients as well.
Okay. And here somebody said that this would be a good talking point with families if there's at all a chance that raw milk gets more antibiotics than pasteurized milk.
Yes, that is an excellent point as well. Yeah, because I think the families um, who tend to want the more natural, less processed in quotes, raw milk would also be averse to antibiotics for sure. So that's a great point.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think there's quite a few questions that came in, and we're to the end of them. So we'll
Okay.
give another 10 seconds for anybody else to ask, and if not, we'll get everybody out to go see patients.
All right.
Okay, thank you very much.